In 1700, India controlled a quarter of the world's wealth. It was richer than Britain, more powerful than any empire in Europe. But by 1947, that number dropped to just 4%. The question is, what happened? How does the richest nation on earth become one of the poorest without a single full-scale war? The answer is in conquest. It's accounting, a silent weapon that rewrote the destiny of a continent. Because this wasn't just the fall of an empire, it was the invention of a system that still decides who gets rich and who stays trapped. And once you see how it worked, you'll never look at money, debt, or power the same way again. Subscribe to the Wealth Archive, where every story of the past exposes the blueprint of the present. The deeper you go, the clearer the pattern becomes. Long before the British arrived, India was a powerhouse of production and trade. Under the Mughal Empire, over 150 million people lived in one of the most sophisticated economies on earth. Agriculture thrived under vast irrigation networks. Ports like Surat and Calcutta were alive with merchants from every corner of the known world. Indian textiles were the envy of Europe. Pepper, indigo, silk, luxury goods that filled palaces and treasuries across continents. Gold and silver flowed into India, not out of it. It was one of the few nations in permanent trade surplus. While kingdoms rose and fell in Europe, India's economy remained steady, confident, and rich. But across the sea, a small island nation was learning a new kind of warfare. One fought not with armies, but with numbers.
In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter for a group of London merchants who called it the East India Company. At first glance, it was just another trading venture, one among many competing for Asia's riches. But this company had something revolutionary: finance. It wasn't a state, yet it behaved like one. It had shareholders, a board of directors, and soon its own army. It was the world's first corporate empire. While Portuguese and Dutch traders sought partnership, the British sought monopoly. Their weapon wasn't the musket, it was money. Ships were financed through bonds, insured at Lloyd's of London, and backed by a growing network of British credit. Capital became a weapon sharper than any sword. How do you conquer a nation without firing a shot? You lend, you tax, and you keep the books. In 1757, the world shifted. At a small battlefield called Plassey, fewer than 1,000 British soldiers and a handful of local allies defeated the Nawab of Bengal. It looked like a skirmish, but it changed the world's economy forever. After the smoke cleared, the East India Company did something unprecedented. It didn't just demand tribute, it demanded taxation rights. The company installed a puppet ruler and granted itself the legal right to collect Bengal's taxes. That single document transformed a trading firm into a government. Corporate conquest had found its formula: military muscle plus financial control. Within a decade, the company was extracting tens of millions of pounds a year from Bengal. That flow of silver funded London's banks, financed Parliament's wars, and inflated the pockets of shareholders who had never set foot in Asia. For them, the famine of Bengal was merely a footnote, a market correction. Even as millions starved, company revenues went up. The British called it good governance. Bengal called it catastrophe. The East India Company had become a nation in disguise. It printed its own currency, ran its own courts, and commanded one of the largest armies in the world. Its flag flew higher than most kingdoms. It ruled by balance sheets. For London's investors, the returns were divine. Dividends soared, stock prices exploded, and the English middle class bought into empire through shares. Empire as investment. It was the birth of a new world, finance as colonization. Soon the British government itself would step in, not to stop the company, but to inherit its machinery. By the 1800s, India had been transformed from an exporter of luxury goods to a supplier of raw materials: cotton, opium, grain, and in return, it imported British manufactured goods. The trade surplus had flipped. Wealth now flowed in one direction, north. Indian economist Dadabhai Naoroji called it the drain of wealth, a quiet bleeding of a civilization. He calculated that hundreds of millions of pounds were leaving India every year without any return. No goods, no services, no exchange, just extraction. Between 1765 and 1938, Historians estimate Britain drained the equivalent of $45 trillion from India. That's more than the GDP of the United States and China combined today. It was wealth pulled not from the earth, but from human labor, measured, taxed, and exported. And yet, in the ledgers of empire, it looked perfectly legitimate.
Every empire justifies itself with a story. Rome claimed civilization. Spain claimed salvation. Britain claimed modernization. They said they were bringing railways, courts, and education. But every one of those gifts was engineered for extraction. The railways were designed to move cotton to ports, not people to prosperity. The courts enforced debt, not justice. The schools trained clerks, not thinkers. Even the railway's financing was a masterpiece of colonial economics. British investors were promised a 5% guaranteed return paid by Indian taxpayers no matter how the railways performed. If profits fell short, India covered the losses. If profits rose, London took the gains. Risk was Indian, reward was British. It was the financial equivalent of a vampire, feeding without bleeding. Between 1876 and 1902, India suffered some of the deadliest famines in history. Over 20 million people died. Yet during those same years, the empire exported millions of tons of grain to Britain. In the empire's arithmetic, exports meant profit, and profit was progress. Human suffering was not a variable. It was a cost of doing business. A British official, Sir Richard Temple, even argued that famine relief would spoil the market. To them, charity distorted the balance sheet. The market had become the measure of morality, and India paid the price. Behind every statistic was a silent revolution that replaced human welfare with financial yield. What mattered wasn't life, but revenue. And in that equation, mercy didn't balance, because compassion doesn't pay dividends. The empire had turned governance into an equation, and in that equation, people were numbers, not lives. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the East India Company was dissolved, and Britain took direct control. But the system didn't change. It simply put on new paperwork. The Raj inherited the same financial machinery: taxation, debt, and the illusion of improvement. The language became softer, the ledgers became thicker, but the extraction stayed the same. Each year, India was billed for something called home charges, payments to Britain for services rendered. They included salaries for British officials in India, pensions for retired civil servants back in London, interest on loans raised in British markets, and the cost of the British Army stationed on Indian soil. It was a masterpiece of accounting alchemy. No goods were exchanged, no services truly provided, just numbers moving across ledgers. One line debited to India, one line credited to Britain. Empire had turned tribute into transactions, conquest into bookkeeping. It was empire by spreadsheet, elegant, efficient, invisible. By the early 20th century, these transfers exceeded £100 million a year, the equivalent of tens of billions today. It was the quiet perfection of financial imperialism, a system so polished it disguised exploitation as administration and theft as management. Empires throughout history took tribute by force. The British took it by formality. Where Rome had soldiers, Britain had accountants. Where Spain had swords, Britain had signatures. And it worked so well that even after the empire ended, the system stayed. Because by then, empire had evolved. It no longer needed colonies. It needed creditors. The weapons were no longer cannons and muskets, but contracts and balance sheets. Control moved from the battlefield to the boardroom, from territory to trade, from taxation to terms of debt. It was empire perfected, an empire of paper, policies, and promises that could bind nations more tightly than any chain. When India finally gained independence in 1947, it inherited more than freedom. It inherited debt. 2 centuries of extraction had hollowed out its industries, drained its reserves, and left it with less than 2% literacy. The railways that connected the empire had done little to connect its people. The factories in Manchester still roared, but the looms in Dhaka were silent. India stood free, but not equal. Its treasury was empty, its people impoverished, and its economic system still wired to serve someone else's profit. And the world it stepped into wasn't free. It was a new financial order built on the same imperial blueprint, only more sophisticated. The language had changed, loans, aid, development, but the math was familiar. A system of deficits, debt, and dependence dressed in the vocabulary of progress. Developing nations became dependent on foreign capital, exporting raw materials, importing finished goods, and borrowing to survive. Interest replaced tribute, repayment replaced obedience. It's the same formula that drained India for 2 centuries, only now the collectors wear suits, not uniforms. And the conquest comes not with armies, but with agreements that look like salvation until the bill arrives. Today, we call it debt dependency, structural adjustment, or economic reform. Different names, same outcome. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank don't send armies, they send conditions. Austerity, privatization, liberalization, each one an echo of the colonial trade laws that once governed India. Every year, developing nations send over $200 billion more in interest and profit repatriation to wealthy countries than they receive in aid. The direction of the drain hasn't changed, it's just become digital. The empire no longer sails, it uploads, managing its colonies through spreadsheets and software instead of soldiers and ships. Its borders are invisible now, drawn in trade agreements, interest rates, and credit ratings. The balance of power is no longer measured in territory, but in data, debt, and control of capital flows. There's a cruel symmetry in this story. When Britain industrialized, it did so with Indian resources, Indian labor, and Indian money. When modern nations industrialize today, they often do it with outsourced labor, foreign debt, and offshore profits. Extraction still pays better than creation because the logic of empire never truly ended, it simply updated its operating system. Empires don't end, they evolve. They move from land to ledger, from gunpowder to contracts, from conquest to compliance, from flags to finance. India's story isn't just about colonialism, it's about the blueprint of our global economy, a design so efficient it made exploitation look like opportunity. The Raj was the first free market experiment, but only one side was free. The ships that once carried silk and spices now carry capital. The same ports that once exported cotton now export code. The banks that once financed empire now finance development. And the profits still flow in the same direction, quietly, endlessly, and with mathematical precision. But this isn't a tale of endless loss, because even after centuries of extraction, India rebuilt. It nationalized its industries, created its own banking system, and began reclaiming what had been taken, not through vengeance, but through reinvention. From famine to food security, from colony to global power, India's recovery became a symbol of endurance. Yet the scars remain. The same wealth gap between the global north and south follows the same historical roots, old trade paths fossilized into financial pipelines. What was once tribute now appears as capital flow, dressed in the language of globalization and investment. The ships that once carried spices now move data. The merchants have become bankers, the flags have been replaced by brands, but the flow remains the same, value rising upward, labor trapped below. Still, India's story is proof that even the deepest wounds of empire can become the foundation of renewal when a nation decides to write its own balance sheet. So ask yourself, when a system rewards extraction more than creation, can it ever be truly free? What Britain proved in India wasn't that empires fall, it's that they adapt. And what India proved is that even the most exploited nations can rise again, rebuild, and redefine what power means in a world still shaped by old equations. But recovery takes time. Extraction is instant. That's the cruel arithmetic of empire. A law written not in ink, but in hunger, labor, and loss. The British didn't just conquer India with soldiers. They conquered it with spreadsheets. And the ledger they opened in 1757, that quiet accounting of gain and loss, is still being balanced today, echoed in every trade deficit, every foreign loan, every modern imbalance that follows the same invisible roots. Only the column titles have changed. Only the accountants wear new faces. History doesn't repeat, but the balance sheets still rhyme, and the numbers never forget. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look. Subscribe and like if you want to understand how financial empires rise and fall.
before it happens again.